The boy didn't drop a single dish, but the men at that table laughed anyway. Bumpy Johnson was sitting 12 feet away. Nobody told them that. Chapter 1. The Table in the Corner. The supper club had a name nobody used anymore. Everyone in Harlem just called it the Room on St. Nicholas. It had low amber lighting, wooden floors worn smooth by 20 years of foot traffic, and a kitchen that stayed open past midnight on Fridays. It was not a famous place. It was not meant to be. And it was the kind of establishment that existed quietly and completely. The kind of place that survived not because of advertising, but because the right people protected it simply by being present inside it. On this particular Friday, the room was about three-quarters full. Couples at small tables near the windows. A few older men at the bar, drinking without urgency. A card game in the back corner that had been going since 7 o'clock and would not stop before 2 in the morning. A jazz from a three-piece near the far wall. Piano, bass, brushed drums. The kind of music that doesn't ask for your attention. It simply fills the air, the way good things do. And moving through all of it, quiet as furniture, was a boy named Clarence, 17 years old. Slight build. A white cotton busboy's jacket 2 sizes too large for his shoulders. Sleeves rolled once at the cuff. He had been working this room for 8 months. Long enough to know every table's rhythm. Long enough to know when to appear and when to disappear. Long enough to have learned the first real professional skill a young man in Harlem could acquire. How to be invisible when invisible is what's needed. He was good at it. He moved between tables without disturbing conversations. He cleared glasses before they became clutter. He refilled water without being asked. The older waitresses had noticed him early. One of them, a woman named May, who had worked the room since before the boy was born, told the manager simply, "That child sees everything and says nothing. Keep him." They kept him. The men arrived at 9:30. 4 of them. Downtown suits, the kind of fabric that doesn't wrinkle no matter how long the evening runs. Gold cufflinks, clean shaves, the smell of something expensive that arrived in the room slightly before they did. They were led to a center table by the host, Sheen, who smiled with the practiced warmth of a man who has learned to be welcoming without being warm. They were not from Harlem. That was clear in the first 30 seconds. Not from the clothing. Plenty of well-dressed men came through this room. It was something else. It was the way they looked at the space. Not with curiosity, not with appreciation. With the casual, half-bored assessment of men who believe that any room they enter is automatically elevated by their presence. They sat down heavily, ordered immediately. Did not look at the menu so much as gesture toward it. One of them, the loudest, the one who laughed first and longest at his own observations, leaned back in his chair and let his eyes move around the room the way a man surveys property he is considering purchasing. His gaze was not hostile. It was something quieter and more corrosive than hostility. It was indifference, the kind that does not see people, only scenery. Clarence came to clear the adjacent table. He moved the way he always moved, efficiently, silently. Eyes down on the work, hands steady, stacking plates with the focused attention of someone who takes even small tasks seriously. He was good at this. He had been doing it long enough that the motions were almost graceful. The loud man at the center table noticed him and decided he was funny. So it started as a comment to his companions, low enough that Clarence may not have heard the exact words, but loud enough that the intention carried clearly across the space between tables. A comment about the jacket, about the size of it, about the boy inside it. His companions laughed, the easy, unthinking laughter of men who have never once considered who might be listening. Clarence did not stop moving. He kept stacking, kept clearing. His face did not change, but his hands, the hands May had described as the steadiest she had ever seen on a busboy, paused for exactly 1/2 second on the edge of a glass. Just 1/2 second. Then continued. The loud man, emboldened by the laughter, said something else. This time directed at the boy. Directly. Loud enough now that there was no ambiguity, no possibility of mishearing, no charity of accident. It was the particular cruelty that requires an audience and mistakes silence for permission. Clarence placed the last glass on his tray, straightened up, and walked toward the kitchen without answering, without looking back, without giving the table the satisfaction of a reaction, because that was the discipline he had, at 17 years old, already learned to wear like armor. But armor is not the same as not feeling it. The room noticed, not loudly, not with the dramatic shifting of chairs or the sudden silence of stopped conversations. Harlem does not perform its awareness for outsiders. It simply knows. And the knowing moved through the room in a quiet current. A glance exchanged between two women at a window table. A stillness that settled into the card game in the back corner. A barely perceptible pause in the piano player's left hand. The room knew. And the room looked, for just a moment, toward a table near the side wall. A table where a single man sat with a glass of water, a plate he had been eating from without hurry, and the particular quality of stillness that is not passivity, but patience. He had not looked up when the men arrived. He had not looked up when the laughter began, but he had heard it, every word of it. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, the man Harlem called Bumpy, set his fork down slowly, the way a man sets something down when he has decided he is finished with one thing and is now considering another. He picked up his glass, took a single sip of water, and for the first time since the men had entered the room, he raised his eyes toward their table. He did not stare. He did not signal. He did not lean over to the man beside him and say a single word. He simply looked, the way a man looks at something he is deciding what to do about. The jazz continued. The candles burned. The card game resumed in the back corner. And in the kitchen, a 17-year-old boy in an oversized white jacket stood at the sink, with his back to the door, pressing both hands flat against the cold edge of the counter, breathing, waiting for the feeling to pass. It had not passed yet. Chapter 2. What Harlem Felt Like. From the outside. There is something that people who have never lived in Harlem consistently misunderstand about it. They see the geography. They see the avenues, the brownstones, the storefronts, and the churches standing shoulder to shoulder with the numbers houses. They see the people moving through it. Working people, church people, hustlers, artists, old women with groceries, and young men with nowhere specific to be. They see all of it and they construct a version of the place in their minds that is about poverty or about danger or about something exotic and consumable. What they do not see is the architecture underneath all of that. The invisible structure. The web of obligations and loyalties and unspoken contracts that holds a community together, not because anyone wrote them down, but because everyone understands them. Harlem in those years was not lawless. It operated according to laws that simply were not printed in any municipal code. Laws about who you show respect to. Laws about whose business you do not interfere with. Laws about what you do not say to a man's face, and what happens when you do. These laws were not taught, and they were absorbed. Absorbed through years of proximity and consequence, through watching what happened when someone violated them, and watching what happened when someone upheld them. Through the stories that moved through the community the way music moves. Not announced, not explained, simply present, filling the air until it was part of you. The men at the center table had absorbed none of this. Downtown money had a particular relationship with Harlem during those years. It visited, no, it consumed. It spent freely at certain establishments and in certain transactions, and it told itself that spending freely was the same as belonging, or at minimum the same as being welcome. It came uptown for the jazz and the food and the particular electricity that the neighborhood generated. That unmistakable current of talent and resilience and style that even the most oblivious outsider could feel the moment they stepped off the right block. But downtown money did not come to Harlem to understand it. It came the way wealthy men have always approached places built by people with less wealth, as guests who have quietly, privately, decided they are actually the hosts. The four men at the center table were of this type. They had been to Harlem before, perhaps many times. They had eaten well and drunk well and gone home with stories that they told at other tables in other rooms. Nice stories in which Harlem was colorful, and the people in it were characters, and the whole evening was a kind of theater, arranged for their pleasure. They had never been corrected in this assumption. Nobody had ever needed to correct it, because nobody who mattered had ever been watching. Tonight was different. Not because Bumpy Johnson had planned to be in that room. He had not planned anything. He had come for a meal. No, the same as he came most Friday evenings. Not because the food was extraordinary, though it was, but because the room on St. Nicholas was one of the few places in his life where he could sit without someone needing something from him. No requests, no disputes to settle, no men waiting at the edge of his table to deliver news or seek permission. Just the jazz, the amber light, the particular piece of a room that knew who he was and loved him enough to leave him alone. He had been coming here for years. He had watched Clarence grow from a nervous boy who dropped a water glass on his second shift to the focused, dignified young man who moved through that room now as though he had been born to it. Bumpy had never spoken to the boy directly. He had simply noticed him, the way he noticed everything, quietly, completely, filing it away somewhere useful. He had noticed the steadiness of those hands. He had noticed the discipline in the boy's face when difficult customers were difficult. He had noticed most of all the thing that Clarence did not yet fully understand about himself, that he was not merely good at the work. He was built for something larger than the work. The work was just where you could see it clearly. Bumpy recognized that quality because he had once possessed it himself at 17, moving through a different kind of room with a different kind of tray, invisible to the people who thought they owned the space. He knew exactly what it felt like. And so when the laughter came from the center table, that particular quality of laughter, the kind that uses another person as its raw material, Bumpy did not need to look up immediately to understand what was happening. He had heard that laughter before. He had heard it in 100 different rooms, across 100 different years. It was the laughter of men who have never been made to reckon with anything. Men who have moved through the world so smoothly, with so few consequences, that they have confused the absence of resistance for the absence of danger. They were not bad men, necessarily. That was the thing that people misunderstood about moments like this one. Bumpy Johnson had known genuinely dangerous men, men with cold purposes and clear intentions. These were not those men, and these were something more ordinary and in some ways more insidious. Men who were simply thoughtless, men who had never developed the instinct for consequence, because consequence had never developed an interest in them. Until tonight. The community in that room understood something in the wordless way that communities understand things. They understood that an accounting was coming, not violence. Nobody in that room expected violence. Violence would have been almost too simple, too legible. What was coming was something that required more from everyone involved. It required patience. It required a kind of architecture, the construction of a moment in which the men at the center table would be made to feel, fully and without ambiguity, the weight of what they had done, not to Bumpy, to the boy. That was the part that mattered. That was what made this different from a dispute over territory or money or any of the other transactions that occupied most of Bumpy's days. This was not about him. This was about a 17-year-old in an oversized white jacket who had done nothing wrong, who had in fact done everything right, and had been laughed at anyway. In Harlem, that was not a small thing. In Harlem, a man who will not stand between a boy and humiliation is not a man who has power. He is simply a man who has money. And Bumpy Johnson had always understood the difference between those two things with the kind of clarity that cannot be taught in any school, only earned through the specific education of having been a young man with neither. He set his glass down. He looked toward the kitchen door, which had not opened since Clarence walked through it. He waited. The room waited with him. The jazz continued because the musicians were professionals, and professionals do not stop playing. But the piano player, an older man who had known Bumpy since before either of them had gray in their hair, let his left hand settle into something slower, something that gave the room more air, more space for whatever was about to happen next. The men at the center table ordered another round of drinks. They had no idea. Chapter 3. Bumpy Watches. He did not move right away. That was the first thing. The thing that the people in that room would remember later. Not what Bumpy Johnson eventually did, but how long he waited before doing anything at all. Because in a world that mistakes speed for strength, Bumpy had always understood that the most powerful thing a man can do in a charged moment is absolutely nothing. Nothing. Performed with complete intention. He sat with his water glass and the remains of his meal and the low amber light falling across the table, and he watched the kitchen door. 2 minutes passed, maybe 3. The men at the center table had moved on. New drinks had arrived. The loud one, the one who had directed his comments at Clarence specifically, was now holding court on some other subject, his voice carrying across the room with the confidence of a man who has never once been told to lower it. His companions leaned in, laughed on cue, refilled their glasses. They were comfortable. That was the word for it. Men who have spent their entire lives being comfortable develop a kind of impermeability to atmosphere. They cannot read a room because they have never needed to. Every room has always adjusted itself to them. The temperature, the noise level, the behavior of the people around them. All of it has always bent in their direction without them having to ask. They were comfortable now. And comfort, in the wrong room, is its own kind of blindness. May came out of the kitchen first. She walked to the bar, said something quietly to the man behind it, and he nodded once, without looking up from the glass he was polishing. She did not look at Bumpy's table. She did not need to. The understanding between people who have shared a space for years operates below the level of eye contact. It moves through posture, through the particular angle of a shoulder, through the speed at which someone walks from one point to another. May walked back toward the kitchen at a specific speed. May not rushed, not slow. The speed of someone who has assessed a situation and returned to their position, knowing that whatever needs to happen next does not require her. 2 of the older men at the bar had shifted slightly on their stools. Not dramatically. Just enough. The way water finds a new level when the vessel tilts. They were facing a different direction now. Not toward the center table, not toward Bumpy, but somewhere in between. Alert, without advertising it. The card game in the back had gone quieter. The men still held their cards. Money still sat at the center of the table. But the conversation between hands had slowed, paused. The players were listening to the room the way experienced people listen, not with their ears turned toward a specific sound, but with their whole bodies oriented toward the quality of silence between sounds. Something was building, not toward explosion, toward clarity. Bumpy pushed his plate to the side. It was a small gesture. Anyone watching who did not know him might have thought nothing of it. A man finishing his meal, making room on the table. But the people in that room knew him. And they understood that the plate being moved meant that Bumpy Johnson had finished one thing and was now, without announcement, beginning another. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at the center table for the first time since the laughter had begun. Not a glare, not a threat, and just a look. The kind of direct, unhurried attention that most people never fully direct at anything, because most people are too busy managing their own anxiety to ever be fully present in a moment. Bumpy was present. Completely. The loud man had not noticed. He was deep in his story now, his hands moving to illustrate some point, his companions arranged in their postures of attentive amusement. The second man was quieter, more watchful than the others. The one who had laughed less and observed more caught something in his peripheral vision and turned slightly. He saw Bumpy looking. He did not know who Bumpy was. But something in the quality of that gaze, something in the absolute stillness that surrounded it, reached past his conscious mind and touched something more primitive. Some animal instinct that the years of boardrooms and country clubs and comfortable rooms had buried but not fully extinguished. He looked away first, then, a moment later, without understanding why, he looked back. Bumpy was still watching. The quieter man picked up his drink, set it down without sipping from it, shifted in his chair. Said nothing to his companions, but the ease had left his posture. Something had changed in him, a small structural shift. The way a building sounds different when one of its foundational beams begins to feel the weight placed upon it. He felt it. He did not know what he felt. The kitchen door opened. Clarence came through it carrying a fresh tray, restocked for the next round of clearing. His face had been recalibrated during those minutes in the kitchen. Not blank, but composed. He had taken what he needed to take from that moment alone at the sink, and he had rebuilt himself into the version that could continue working. He was 17. He had already learned to do this. There was something in that. Something that Bumpy saw and felt as a kind of dull, specific grief, that a boy that young had already developed that skill, the skill of absorbing a wound in private and returning to the room as though the wound had not happened. It was a skill Bumpy knew intimately. It was the skill that kept men upright in places that wanted them on the floor. It was necessary. It was also a cost. And it was being paid right now by a 17-year-old who deserved to be spending his Friday evening in a different kind of uncomplicated way entirely. Clarence moved back into the room. He did not look at the center table. His route took him to the far side deliberately, either by his own instinct or by the quiet guidance of May, who understood the geometry of difficult rooms. He worked the far tables, efficient, focused, the oversized jacket moving through the amber light like a small white sail. Bumpy watched him, then looked back at the center table. The loud man was laughing again, still comfortable, still unaware. And there is a specific kind of patience that is not passive. Most people understand patience as the absence of action, waiting without moving, enduring without responding. That is one kind. It is the kind that exhaustion produces. It is the kind that fear produces. It is the kind that people mistake for weakness, because it looks, from the outside, like surrender. But there is another kind, the kind that predators possess. Now, the kind that belongs to men who have learned that timing is not merely tactical, it is moral. That the right moment, waited for with complete stillness and complete attention, carries more weight than 10 actions taken in haste. That a word spoken at the exact right second lands with a force that no volume can replicate. Bumpy Johnson sat at his table near the sidewall and practiced this second kind of patience. He was waiting for a specific moment, not a dramatic one, not a moment that announced itself. A quiet one, the kind that passes unnoticed by everyone in the room, except the one man positioned to use it. He had learned, over decades, to recognize these moments the way a musician recognizes the precise beat, where something needs to be played and something else needs to stop. He would know it when it arrived. The loud man called for the check. He said it the way he said everything, projected outward for the room, as though the room were an extension of his comfort. He flagged down the nearest server with the kind of gesture that does not ask, but summons. The server, a young woman named Patricia, who had worked the room for 3 years and was not easily rattled, took the gesture in stride and moved toward the register. The 4 men began gathering themselves, adjusting jackets, finishing last sips, the ritual preparation of departure. The loud man made one final comment to his companions, something that produced the last round of laughter from their table, laughter that swept across the room and broke against the walls and dissolved into the jazz. Clarence was at the far end of the room. He did not react, but his hand stopped moving for a half second. Just a half second. Bumpy saw it. He unfolded his hands. He placed both palms flat on the table. And for the first time all evening, he shifted his weight, not standing, not yet, but settling into a different orientation. The way a man settles just before he rises. The way something that has been completely still prepares to move. The quieter man at the center table, the one who had caught Bumpy's gaze earlier, looked over again. This time, Bumpy was not watching the center table. He was watching the door. Chapter 4. The door stays closed. Patricia brought the check on a small black tray. She set it at the edge of the center table with the practiced neutrality of someone who has learned to deliver things without commentary. The loud man reached for it without looking, the automatic gesture of a man accustomed to being the one who pays. Not out of generosity, necessarily, but out of the particular dominance that comes with controlling the moment of departure. He opened the leather fold, and counted out the bills with the deliberate looseness of a man who wants the table to see that the amount does not trouble him. Left it there, pushed back his chair. The 4 men rose in the staggered way that groups rise. The loud one first, then the others in his wake, arranging themselves around him the way planets arrange themselves around the body with the most gravity. Jackets straightened, cufflinks adjusted. the collective posture of men preparing to carry themselves back out into the world they came from. The loud man said something to the table, a closing remark, the conversational period at the end of the evening's sentence. More laughter. Then they turned collectively toward the exit, toward the front door, which was approximately 30 feet away. 30 feet that would take them past 3 tables, past the bar, past the coat rack near the entrance, and out into the night air of St. a Nicholas Avenue, where they would find their car or hail a cab and return downtown with nothing more than a good meal and a story about an evening uptown. 30 feet. They began walking. They had covered perhaps 10 of those feet when they became aware that something in the room had changed. It was not a sound. It was not a visible obstruction. There was no one standing in their path. The aisle to the door was clear. Patricia had stepped back toward the bar. The host was at his station near the entrance, as he always was. Nothing was physically different. And yet, the atmosphere of the room had shifted in a way that was difficult to name and impossible to ignore. Like the pressure change before weather arrives, not the storm itself, but the quality of air that precedes it. Something that reaches the body before the mind has finished its sentence. The quieter man felt it first. He slowed his pace, almost imperceptibly. His eyes moved across the room, not with panic, but with the recalibrated attention of someone whose instincts have just overridden his assumptions. He scanned the bar, the tables, the card game in the back, the server who had taken their payment. Then his eyes found Bumpy Johnson. Who was standing now? He had not stood dramatically. There was no scrape of chair legs across wooden floors, no sudden movement that drew the eye with urgency. He had simply risen, quietly and completely, the way a man rises when he has decided it is time, and the decision was made some minutes ago, and the rising is merely the final physical expression of something long since settled. He was not a large man. People who had never met Bumpy Johnson sometimes expected size, expected the physical vocabulary of intimidation, the broad shoulders and the hard eyes and the specific architecture of a man built to frighten other men. What they found instead was something that confused them initially, before it unsettled them. He was composed. That was the word that kept returning to anyone who tried to describe him in moments like this. Not calm in the way of someone suppressing something. Calm in the way of someone who has arrived at a conclusion and is no longer conflicted about it. The calm of a verdict already rendered, waiting only for the sentence to be read aloud. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his water glass, finished what remained in it, and set it back on the table with the quiet finality of a man who has just closed a door. Then he looked at the 4 men standing in the middle of the room. He did not say anything immediately. That was the thing that would stay with the quieter man for years afterward. The silence that preceded the words. Most men, when they want to assert authority, fill space with volume. They arrive loudly into confrontations. They make themselves heard before they make themselves felt. It is a form of anxiety disguised as aggression, the need to occupy the moment before someone else does. Bumpy occupied it differently. He occupied it by doing nothing. He stood at his table and looked at the 4 men and let the silence work. Let it build. Let it fill the room, the way the jazz had been filling it all evening. Not aggressively, but completely. Until there was no space in it that was not his. And the loud man had stopped walking. He was not sure precisely when he had stopped. Only that at some point between the table and the door, the forward momentum of the evening had simply ceased. He was standing in the middle of a room in Harlem, and a man he did not know was looking at him from 12 feet away, and something about the totality of the situation, the stillness of the other patrons, the specific quality of the attention being directed at him, the fact that absolutely no one else in the room appeared surprised by any of this, had reached through his confidence and touched the thing underneath it. He laughed, a short, uncertain laugh, the kind that is not amusement but reflex, the social mechanism that men use when they do not know what else to do with their face. Nobody in the room laughed with him. Bumpy spoke 2 sentences, delivered at the volume of a private conversation, not a whisper. That would have been theatrical. And Bumpy had no use for theater. Just the normal, unhurried register of a man saying something he means completely and wants heard clearly. He said, "Gentlemen, I need a moment of your time before you go." That was all. No threat embedded in the language, no raised inflection, no word that could be pointed to later as an explicit warning or a provocation. Just a simple request. The kind of request that, in its very simplicity, communicated more than a paragraph of elaboration could have. Because the simplicity was the message. A man who has nothing to prove does not prove it loudly. A man who is certain of the outcome does not need to threaten the outcome. The request was calm because the outcome was already decided. The men had not been asked to stay. They had been informed in the most courteous possible language that they were going to stay. The host near the front door had taken a single step to his left. Just one step. He was no longer directly beside the door, and that he was beside the coat rack. The distinction was small and enormous. The loud man looked at the host. The host looked back at him with the same practiced warmth he had shown when the men arrived. That welcoming expression that was professionally warm without being personally invested. He did not speak. He did not block the door with his body. He simply stood where he stood and looked back at the man looking at him. The loud man looked at his companions, and the quieter one gave him nothing, just a barely perceptible shake of the head. The kind of signal that passes between men when one of them has assessed a situation more clearly than the other, and is communicating without words, not here, not this, not tonight. The other two were looking at the floor, not in shame, in the particular studied neutrality of men who have decided that the wisest thing they can do right now is to not be visibly part of whatever is about to happen. The loud man looked back at Bumpy. Bumpy had not moved, had not shifted his weight, had not taken a step toward them or away from them. He was standing at his table with his hands at his sides and his jacket straight, and that expression on his face that was not anger and not menace, but something that had no comfortable name in the vocabulary that the loud man had been given by his life. It was authority. Not purchased, not borrowed, not performed, earned. The loud man cleared his throat. Then he said, "Of course," and sat back down. His three companions sat with him. The check, the one he had already paid, the one that represented the conclusion of the evening, the physical evidence of departure, sat on the black tray at the edge of the table. Patricia had not collected it yet. She was at the bar with her back turned, doing something with glasses that required her complete attention. The jazz continued. The card game resumed in the back corner. The two older men at the bar turned back toward their drinks, and the room exhaled, not audibly, not as a dramatic collective breath, but in the way that rooms exhale when something that has been suspended is now in motion, when the waiting is over and what comes next has begun. Bumpy walked toward their table, slowly, the way a man walks when he's not walking toward something, but arriving at it, a distinction that the body understands before the mind catches up. Now, he stopped at the edge of their table. He did not pull out a chair. He stood. He looked at each of the four men in turn, not with malice, not with theater, just with the complete unhurried attention of someone taking a full inventory of what is in front of him. Then he looked toward the kitchen door. And he waited. Chapter 5. The lesson served at the table. The kitchen door opened. Clarence came through it the way he always came through it. Tray in hand, eyes forward, had the professional composure that had become his second nature over 8 months of Fridays in this room. He had a table to clear on the far left. He had not been summoned. He did not know yet that anything had changed in the geometry of the evening. He took 3 steps into the room. Then he saw the 4 men still seated at the center table. He saw Bumpy Johnson standing at the edge of it. He stopped, and not with alarm, with the careful stillness of someone who has learned to read a room quickly and is reading this one now, processing the information available to him, assembling it into something that made sense. His eyes moved from the men to Bumpy, then back to the men, and then, briefly and voluntarily, to Bumpy again. Bumpy looked at him. A single look, not beckoning, not commanding. Something quieter than either of those things. The look of a man saying, without words, come here, when you are part of this. Not as a victim, as a witness, as the reason this is happening at all. Clarence understood it. He set his tray on the nearest empty table, and he walked over. He stopped a few feet behind Bumpy and to his left, not hiding, not cowering, but positioned in the way that people position themselves when they are present for something important, and understand that their role right now is to be present, not to lead. He stood straight, hands at his sides, and the oversized white jacket somehow looking, in this particular moment, less like something he hadn't grown into yet, and more like something he was in the process of earning. Bumpy did not introduce him, did not gesture toward him, did not say his name. He simply stood where he stood, and Clarence stood where he stood, and the physical arrangement of the two of them together, the older man and the younger one, the one at the end of something and the one at the beginning of it, so standing side by side at the edge of a table where four wealthy men sat in the particular discomfort of people who are used to defining every room they enter, communicated something that no introduction could have improved upon. The loud man was looking at the tablecloth. Bumpy spoke. He spoke the way he always spoke when something mattered, quietly, without decoration, with the specific economy of a man who has never needed volume to be heard. Then he said, "This young man has been working this room since before you sat down tonight. He does his job well. He does it with more dignity than most grown men I know." He paused, not for effect, not as a rhetorical device. He paused because what he was about to say next deserved its own space, its own silence to land in. "You made him the subject of your entertainment. I want you to understand what that cost, not what that will cost, not a threat about future consequence. What that cost, past tense, already spent." The loud man opened his mouth, closed it. He was a man who was accustomed to filling silences, to being the one whose voice shaped the air in any room he occupied. In this moment, he had no voice, not because it had been taken from him, because the space where his voice usually lived had been completely and quietly occupied by something else. He looked at his companions. The quieter one was looking at the table. The other two had not moved. Bumpy let the silence continue for exactly as long as it needed to. Then he looked at Clarence. Not at the four men, at Clarence. This was the pivot. This was the thing that the room had been waiting for. Not the confrontation with the men, but this, the turn. The moment where Bumpy Johnson demonstrated, through the simple act of where he directed his attention, what this evening was actually about. He said, "You know what kind of man you are?" Clarence looked at him. Now, he was 17 years old. He had spent the last 40 minutes in a kitchen, with his hands pressed against a cold counter, breathing through something that had no clean resolution, that had simply happened to him and been absorbed without recourse, because that was what you did. Because there was no other option available to him in that moment. He said nothing. Bumpy nodded slowly, as though the silence itself was the answer he had expected, as though the discipline of that silence, the refusal to perform pain for an audience that didn't deserve access to it, was itself the evidence he was pointing to. "The kind," Bumpy said, "that still comes back through that door." He let that sit. Then he turned back to the four men. When he looked at them now, something had shifted in the quality of his attention. The assessment was over. The inventory had been taken. What replaced it was something more direct, not hostile, but final. And the expression of a man who has said what needed saying and is now simply delivering the conclusion. He said, "You came to this neighborhood tonight. You ate at this table. You were served well." He looked at the loud man specifically. "And you used a boy who was serving you as the punchline of a joke." The loud man said, "Look, we didn't mean—" "I know," Bumpy said, simple, immediate, cutting the sentence off not with anger, but with the quiet blade of complete understanding. "So, that's the part I need you to sit with." He let one beat pass. "You didn't mean it. You never mean it. And it happens anyway. Every time. And the boy still has to go into the kitchen and put his hands on something cold and breathe until he can come back out again." He said it without raising his voice. He said it the way you say something that is simply true, without needing the listener's agreement, without requiring their validation, keen without performing emotion for the sake of convincing anyone of anything. He said it with the authority of someone who has inhabited that kitchen, that cold counter, that particular kind of breathing in one form or another, for his entire life. The loud man said nothing. For the first time all evening, genuinely, completely, he said nothing. The quieter man looked up from the table. He looked at Bumpy, then at Clarence, then back at Bumpy. His face had changed. Not dramatically. Men like him do not make dramatic expressions in public. But the architecture of it had shifted. Some load-bearing assumption had been quietly removed, and the structure above it had settled into a new configuration. He looked like a man who has just been shown something he had always theoretically known existed, but had never, until this specific moment, actually seen. He said quietly, "You're right." 2 words. Offered without qualification. Without the hedging and contextualization that men use to apologize for something while simultaneously minimizing it. Just 2 words, placed on the table between them like something being returned to its rightful owner. Bumpy looked at him, nodded once, then looked at the loud man. The loud man was still looking at the tablecloth. His jaw was tight. He had the particular tightness of a man who is processing something uncomfortable and has not yet decided what to do with it, whether to let it in or construct a reason to dismiss it the moment he is outside this room and back in the world where these reckonings do not reach him. Bumpy gave him time. He was not in a hurry. He had never been in a hurry for the right thing to happen. The loud man looked up. He looked at Clarence, not through him, not past him, not at the jacket or the youth or the position, at the person inside all of those things, at the 17-year-old who had done nothing wrong and absorbed something anyway and come back through the kitchen door and was still standing here, straight-backed, in an oversized white jacket, asking for nothing. The loud man said, "I'm sorry." He said it quietly enough that it was not a performance, quietly enough that it was not for the room. It was for Clarence, just for Clarence. And Bumpy did not respond to the apology. He did not accept it on anyone's behalf. It was not his to accept. He simply stood where he stood and let the apology travel the short distance between the man who had given it and the boy it belonged to. Clarence received it the way he received everything that evening, without excess, without theater. He looked at the man for a moment. Then he gave a single nod, small, complete. The nod of someone who has accepted something without pretending that the acceptance erases what preceded it. The nod of a person who's going to be fine, not because the wound did not happen, but because he has already demonstrated, tonight and in the kitchen, and in the 8 months before tonight, that wounds do not define the architecture of who he is. The room breathed. Bumpy straightened his jacket. He looked at the 4 men one final time, not with triumph, not with contempt, and not with any of the emotions that lesser men would have brought to the conclusion of a moment like this one. With something simpler, with the expression of a man who has done what needed to be done and considers the matter resolved. He said, "Enjoy the rest of your evening, gentlemen." And he walked back to his table. He sat down. He picked up his water glass, which Patricia had refilled at some point during the preceding minutes, silently, without being asked, and he drank from it. And that was all. The 4 men sat at the center table for another 10 minutes before they left. They did not call for their check again. Patricia brought a fresh one quietly, without being asked for that either. The loud man paid it without the looseness of the earlier gesture, without the performance of ease. He paid it as a man pays for something he is simply settling. They left without speaking to each other. They passed Bumpy's table on the way to the door. The quieter man paused beside it for half a second. He did not say anything. He simply paused. A half-second acknowledgement, the smallest possible gesture of recognition, offered and received. Bumpy did not look up. He didn't need to. Clarence watched them go from the far side of the room. He had his tray again. He was back at work, moving between tables, clearing, resetting, doing the job with the same focused attention he had brought to every other Friday for the last 8 months. But something was different. Not in how he moved, not in what he did, in the quality of the stillness at the center of it. Something had been placed inside him tonight, not by the apology, which mattered, but by something that happened before the apology. By the moment a man he barely knew had looked at him across a room and decided, without being asked, without any obligation, without any benefit to himself, that what happened to that boy mattered. That a 17-year-old in an oversized white jacket moving through an amber-lit room on a Friday night was worth stopping an evening for, was worth the weight of a man's full attention, was worth the message that message sent to the boy, to the men, to every person in that room who watched it happen. May passed Clarence near the kitchen door. She didn't say anything. She touched his shoulder once, briefly, as she passed. That was enough. Chapter 6. What the boy remembered. Years passed. The room on St. Nicholas eventually closed. The way all rooms close eventually. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the gradual accumulation of small changes. A lease that wasn't renewed. A neighborhood that shifted. The particular generation that had made a place what it was. Moving on or moving out or simply aging into stillness. The jazz stopped. The amber light went dark. The wooden floors, now worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, were covered over by something newer and less patient. But the people who had been inside it carried it with them. That is the thing about rooms that matter. They do not end when they close. They continue inside the people who inhabited them. Intact, specific, available to be returned to at any moment with complete fidelity. The smell of the kitchen, the sound of the brushed drums, the particular quality of light that made everyone inside look somehow like a better version of themselves. Clarence carried it with him. All of it. He was not a busboy anymore. The years had done what years do to young men who have the right combination of discipline and dignity, and the particular fortune of being seen, at the right moment, by the right person. He had worked, he had built, he had moved through the world with the careful attention and the quiet competence that May had recognized in him on his second shift. When he dropped a water glass and then immediately and without being told, cleaned up every piece of it himself. He had become, in the specific vocabulary of the community that had produced him, somebody. Not famous, not notorious, not the kind of somebody that newspapers write about or that names get attached to in the retelling of large historical events. The other kind of somebody. The kind that a neighborhood produces quietly and consistently. The kind that shows up in the lives of the people around them as a steady, reliable presence. A man who employs other men. A man who knows which families need what and finds ways to make sure they have it. A man whose word, in the specific geography of his community, means something durable. He had become, in other words, what Bumpy Johnson had seen in the way he held a tray at 17. He told the story at different points throughout his life, not often, not as a centerpiece story. Not the kind of tale a man performs at large gatherings to position himself within a mythology. He told it the way a person tells something that genuinely shaped them, quietly to specific people, in specific moments when the story was the right tool for what needed to be communicated. He told it to young men mostly. Young men who were at the beginning of something. Young men who were carrying the particular kind of hurt that comes from being dismissed or overlooked or made the subject of someone else's amusement. The hurt that sits in the chest like a stone and tells you in the quiet of the kitchen, with your hands pressed against something cold, that maybe the people doing the dismissing are right about you. That maybe you are exactly as small as they are treating you. He told them about the Friday. No, not about the insult. That was not the point of the story. And he had learned over the years to move through it quickly, to give it no more weight in the telling than it deserved. It had happened. It had been absorbed. It was the preface, not the text. The point of the story was always the same. A man I barely knew decided I was worth stopping his evening for. He was careful, always, about how he told the part about Bumpy. Because Bumpy Johnson was a complicated man. Clarence had understood that even at 17, had understood it with the instinctive moral intelligence of a young person who has not yet learned to flatten complicated things into simple ones. Bumpy Johnson did things that Clarence would not have done, operated in spaces that Clarence would not have entered, made arrangements with the world that required a specific kind of accounting that Clarence had no interest in maintaining. He knew all of that. He said all of that, when he told the story to the young men who were listening. He was not a simple man, Clarence would say, and I am not asking you to be what he was. He would pause there. But what he did that night, the decision he made, the way he made it, what he said and what he didn't say, that was not complicated. That was one of the clearest things I have ever seen a person do. What he came back to, always, was the order. The specific, deliberate, unmistakable order in which Bumpy had spoken. He had spoken to Clarence first, before the apology, before the reckoning, before anything was resolved or extracted or delivered. He had turned to the boy and spoken to him first, directly, personally, as a full human being with a specific quality and a specific worth. And only then had he turned to the men at the table. The order was not accidental. Clarence had understood that even in the moment, 17 years old and still processing everything, standing in his oversized white jacket in the amber light of a room that had just shifted its entire weight in his direction. He had understood it the way you understand certain things that bypass explanation and arrive directly in the body. The order said, "You are not the aftermath of this. You are the reason for it." The order said, "I am not doing this to prove something to them. I am doing this because of you." The order said, "Your dignity is not a consequence of their apology." It preceded their apology, it quietly, completely, without raising his voice.